a couple of months ago, or about a year ago, we got interested in a specific domain. And so, and I'm very happy to talk to you about this one because we were pretty much in a stealth mode until now. And the domain is privacy. So it's this idea that we all have our digital shadows spread throughout the internet, and we're no longer in control of those. And that's what this talk is about today. And to introduce that, I would like to introduce Thorsten Dietmar. So um, as I said, about a year ago, we partnered with Polypoly. Polypoly is a new startup in Germany, and Thorsten will talk to you about what that means and how we operate there. And then we will look a little bit, we will take a sneak peek behind the scenes as to how we work. So, Thorsten Dietmar.
Hi. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. That is my first ESUG since 25 years or something like that. So I still remember the first ESUG in Brest, and I still have somebody from Gemstone is here. I heard I still have a cup, a red one called Servio. I have some history with Smalltalk and Gemstone. Unfortunately, today I'm only a manager anymore, so I'm not allowed to program anymore. At least whenever I'm trying, he's kicking me away. So, okay, let us talk a few minutes about polypoly, and then he can talk about the real interesting stuff. The last 15 years I was working as a VC, and basically we invested in areas of crisis, so in Africa and Asia and things like that. So we did social impact investments, and then we found out that there's a new area of crisis called Europe, and about our democracy and data privacy and things like that. Together with some large corporates and with the backing of the French and German government, we are building that company in the moment, which is a cooperative, a pan-European cooperative, which is for a digital startup quite an uncommon thing, but there's a good reason for that one. One sentence what I'm hearing quite often is data the new oil. And from my point of view, that's one of the most stupid sentences I ever heard. Basically, because oil is poisoning, and all the economic models around oil is that's horrible, and I definitely don't want to have data used like that. So maybe data is the new sun because we are generating more and more data, or maybe data is a bit like love, because as more you share, it more it gets. So whatever it is definitely not the new oil. So from our point of view, it is that tech fucked that up really. It's not business, it was not law, it was us who really fucked up that whole thing with data privacy. Basically, for two reasons from our point of view. We have created a lot of technologies in the last 20 and 30 years to protect data privacy, like PGP. And when I would ask my mom if she would be able to use PGP, she would say no. If I would ask my daughter if she is willing to use PGP, she would also say no. My mom, because for her it's just unusable because it's not understandable, and my daughter, she would say it's uncool. Basically, we have created a technological ecosystem which is so far away from normal human behavior, or which is strict, which is not usable because it's too complex or whatsoever. And the second reason why I think that tech is really the problem here is that there are a lot of tech startups did pitches to VCs, and I saw lots of them, and most of them were really based on asocial business models. So yeah, of course, I love to have a bunch of money to do beautiful things with technology and to play around with the news database and algorithms and whatsoever. But nevertheless, we as technicians have also the responsibility to deliver something which is usable, and which is also not harming anybody. Yeah, I heard quite often that tech guys said, yeah, but business has forced me to do this and this and this and that. And from my point of view, that's a lie. For a very simple reason. What is the most horrible thing that can happen to you as a programmer if you get fired today? Tomorrow, you have a new job with more money. For that reason, nobody can force you to do anything. Yeah? No business guy can force you as a programmer to do something you don't want to. You can just leave them alone. And they're not able to program. So it's up to us to make sure that the stuff we are delivering is something usable and also valuable for the community. So that means as well we have to fix it. Yeah? And I guess one of the most important things, we have to get rid of this drug called speed. Yeah? The whole internet business is driven by speed. If you look at Facebook, for example, it's like a large skyscraper, and we are rebuilding that skyscraper on a daily basis, and we are proud to do so. From my point of view, I would not like to live in a skyscraper which is constantly rebuilt. First of all, there's a lot of noise. Secondly, it's quite unstable, and so on and so forth. So we have to come up with a business model which is not driven by growth and speed. The next thing is because technology is in the core not really the problem. We don't have to reinvent something completely new. We just have to make it usable for people. So what we are using at polypoly is, beside of your stuff, of course, is not really new. Some of these techniques are really quite old, but we are trying to use them in a way that is understandable and usable for normal human beings. So what polypoly is exactly doing is, as I said, we are building that pan-European cooperative, which is completely owned by the users. There's no VC, no country, nobody is involved in that company. If you download our software, you will get automatically for free a share of that company. So all the revenue which will be made by data will be spread to the users afterwards. It's also that the users are under full control of what kind of software will be delivered, what kind of software will be used, what kind of partnerships we are making, and so on and so forth. So a very important part of that one is that we don't have a VC. So it's basically a lot of private people who put some, like me, who put some money in that company, and we convinced around about, in the moment it's around about 10 large European corporates to give us a bunch of money without having any influence on that company and without getting any kind of shares. They just make that because their biggest threat is not how can I say, the biggest threat is Amazon and Facebook and so on and so forth. So for them, it's also quite a small amount of money they have to invest. And for us, this is the money we will need to ramp up that whole thing. The second or the next important thing is that the whole thing is completely decentralized. That's the core of the internet from the day one on. Lucky us, we saw already in history that centralized services will die quite soon. So for example, maybe some of you are old enough to remember CompuServe or Alta Vista or MySpace or whatsoever. All of them had a central service offering, and all of them are dead. So the average age of our internet giant is around about 15 to 20 years, means Facebook, Google, and co are ready to die. I'm not saying that we as polypoly are against them. We don't have problems to work with them together as long as they're having a business model which is not harming the privacy of people or also not harming the ecosystem of a country. So end of the day, we are building quite a boring company, but sustainable and user-friendly and with an awesome piece of software. So that is how it works. So it's a kind of as Smalltalk guys, we can say we have an image. And in this image, you have functions or services, and inside of, and this is encapsulating the data you have. We are using the same protocol than Solid, so the project of Tim Berners-Lee, to communicate with applications or web services or whatsoever. Of course, it's extendable. Like we have in Smalltalk, we had that all the time, saying, okay, it's no problem to extend something during runtime. So we have a feature depot, which is basically something like an app store, but features are much, much smaller, so you can extend that application over the time. And I guess what is maybe the most important thing is down here. We have turned big data upside down. Basically, what we are doing is federated AI and federated big data. So if somebody has a question, sorry for that it's in German. So if somebody wants to do some research on data, he's creating a Lambda, putting that on our question list. And whenever a pod is idling, he's coming across, downloading the Lambda, executing it internally of the privacy of the user, and just give the result back. And so your data don't have to leave your own control to run. Next one. So. Okay, so here's just one day in a polypod. So for example, you can see here with one feature depot, so the user finds out, there's a new feature, for example, for downloading LinkedIn data. And so you can just install the feature. So the Facebook feature was already installed, so you can use that feature to download all the data from Facebook. And what we have here is a very funny one. We did that as a prototype for a large German internet shop. So we built a prototype to analyze the cookie of the cookies of Amazon, and by doing so, we are able to know what is in the shopping cart. So if you're on the website of Amazon and you're shopping on that website, on the fly, you can analyze what's inside of the shopping cart, and an alternative store can make a counter offer. And it's not only about pricing, what we will show there. It will also show how many taxes is this company paying in your country? What is the average salary of a worker in that company? What is the sustainability index of that company? So that you can really see the real price of that product. And then still it's up to the user to make the decision if he wants to take the cheap RAM, maybe from Amazon, or maybe a little bit more expensive one from Otto.de. But these guys are then paying taxes in your country and so on and so forth. So to support all these things, we have so-called editorial services. Editorial services means for us, we have gathered information around about 10 million companies in the world, about their internal structure, who's owning whom, who's sending what kind of data to what other companies. So for example, we made that for PayPal. If you make a single PayPal transaction, your data will be spread to 400 other companies. And most of them, if you're living in Europe, most of them are outside of your own legal frame. Yeah, so they will be sent to Israel or to Canada or to UK, which is still in the moment inside of it, but you never know, and or to America and so on and so forth. And by these editorial services help the pod to present all the information needed to make a decision as a user. I guess that was all, or? Yes.
Thank you. So one thing is to make all this work, right? To make the whole ecosystem work. This is not primarily. It's not a technical problem. Technology is an essential component, but it is not the driver of the whole thing. So, like we as technologists, we always like to put ourselves in the center and then have everything, mold around us, if you want. But in our case, we distinctly want to take the exactly opposite perspective. So one of the things that, for example, we're doing, one of the principles is that everything has to be transparent, and everything has to be transparent from, where do we buy office supplies? That has to be transparent, all the way to how this something, how did you get something on your screen from which piece of data? Everything has to be transparent. There is no black box. And that's an interesting thing, because most of the systems that we use today, they are black boxes. Whenever you use a tool, right, whenever you use a service, that's a black box. You have no idea what's going on behind it. And there's lots that is going on behind it. And so, every time you don't pay for something, you're being the product. And it's not a good thing to have humans being products. And we have to turn this thing completely upside down. And this is not a technological problem. It's, first of all, it's a principle problem. And you start from the principle, and then you build the technology such that it is conducive for that principle. There used to be, in a previous century, Marshall McLuhan was talking about this idea that the tools we use get to shape the way we think. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Well, he was not necessarily the one coining it, but he was the main driver of that idea. But the idea here is that it is very important to understand the characteristics of the tools that we expose ourselves to, because they will determine the way we're going to think. And that applies to the kinds of things. So how many of you, quick question, how many of you looked at your phone within 5 minutes of waking up? How many of you looked at your phone within 5 minutes of waking up? So about 50% of you or more. Now the thing is, this need did not exist 12 years ago because there was no tool. The tool has manufactured that need. And this is a fascinating thing. So it's quite important to understand what is it? What are the characteristics of the tools that we expose ourselves to? Because they will determine the way we're going to think. And so this is where, as I said, so this problem here, even technologically, is multifaceted. There are issues and challenges in how do we get this reverse big data model to work? How do we get, which protocols do we use? How do we share things? How do we ensure that, when you're sharing a piece of data, the contract that is associated with it is respected by both parties, and so on and so forth. But I want to tell you a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of how we work when we are researching or developing this idea of the pod. So to do that, because we are in the European Union, and in European Union we have GDPR, GDPR allows you as a user to simply download your data. How many of you knew that? How many knew that you can? Right, thank you. Okay, could you raise also your hand if you have downloaded your data? It's interesting how, out of all people that knew about it, about half of it downloaded it. How many of you actually looked at the data in depth? So if the people that actually downloaded it, right, a very small fraction actually looked at it. Now, this is an interesting thing because GDPR gives you a right, and it's a fundamental right, right? But if you cannot act on it, does it still exist? And that's a real problem. And everything it has to exist. Now, what's the problem here? So here's what I download. For example, if I go to LinkedIn, I download my profile. I actually see something like this. I see a bunch of CSV files. And maybe here I can see, my shares. And basically it looks like this. So, it's a CSV file. And they have complied with the GDPR, which is true, right? This is perfectly legitimate. And it's data that you can actually look at. Now, of course, once you look into the data, GDPR doesn't say that the data must be 100% accurate, or probably does, but the question is, how do you judge that? Right? So once you start to see that a certain column starts to have data that does not belong in that column, then perhaps something is wrong. But if we never exercise that part, right, we will never know. And that's a problem. So that's the very first thing to have. In order to have the right, you have to exercise it. If you don't exercise it, you don't have it. So, okay, let's take a look at what happens at Facebook. So when I download Facebook, Facebook gives me a different kind of thing. So let's say, for example, if I have a folder, and I get JSON. So these are my posts, and if I look at that JSON, what am I doing now? I'm just inspecting this file system, so I can see here, these are the posts with the JSONs, with the timestamp, and now this for most people in the room, I mean, this small percentage of people that actually looked at this data, that is about a fundamental right that you have gained as if you're in the European Union. We have, even in a room full of technical people, only a small fraction has looked at it. What about everybody else that is non-technical, right? They have no chance of understanding what's going on in there. And so that, just simple saying it's not enough. And now, here's the funny thing. So once you go to Twitter, Twitter gives you a JavaScript. Now, wait a second, because we looked at it, right? So what exactly is in this JavaScript? So they probably in an attempt to be helpful, what they're doing is actually they wrap a JSON So the JSON starts here. They wrap it in an assignment to a JavaScript object, right? So that's a fascinating thing. So you see, there are a plethora of even the formats that are being used, and even more variability inside the data structure that they're actually using, right? So there's this very huge gap. For example, if I look at something like Twitter, and I look at this data like this, or I look at it like that, it's a big gap, isn't it? Right? This is something I can relate to. This is something that I see all the time. And that's what we're saying. Every time you use the tool, you use it in a way you're going to generate thoughts that the designer of that tool controls. And it is time, because this is an essential, right, and it has real consequences. It is time to change and reverse that thing. So, and we need to bridge that gap, basically. So the very first characteristics of the pod has to be exactly this. I need to be able to translate what is going on with me or about me out there, right? So that's one thing. Now, let's take a look at how would the pod, for example, look like. So this is actually a pod, and in this pod, I downloaded some of my profiles. So my profile on LinkedIn, my profile on my company's profile or our company's profile on Twitter, my profile on Twitter, on Facebook, and I also have these browsers, right? The browsers are just laying around there, and they look harmless because it's just another tool. And that's quite interesting. Now, one thing is, once I look at if I look at an object, so in this case, right, I'm just clicking on feenk's Twitter account, and there I get, I look at it like this, and I can see, when I'm inspecting that object that is looking at the representation of what I got from data from Twitter, I actually get an interesting presentation that matches my perception of how I used to use the tool. And this is such an important thing. I don't have to make a mental jump. Now, what's interesting here, right, is that because we are now in a moldable environment, so now we are actually looking inside Glamorous Toolkit, at the core of the system, there's actually looking at this piece of data. When I look at this, right, I can understand it from a user perspective. And that's an interesting thing, because now I'm a user and a programmer about my own data, and I want to quickly switch between them, and I don't want to make a mental jump. But both of these things are interesting. Every aspect of the data is interesting, including this, the data that I actually get from Twitter, and I don't have to have to make too much mental jumps to get there. So that's an interesting thing. Now, what can you do with it? I just want to give you a couple of examples of what happens once you start to get a hold of your own data. So one of the things is, for example, is that once I'm here, maybe I just want to see, I just want to browse my tweets, not the way they want me to browse it. By the way, nowadays, they kind of force you to not look at the latest tweets first. They do it based on an algorithms, which allows them to then promote things and then earn money with advertisement, which is okay. It's a valid approach, but it's still it's not something that you can opt out of, and that's an interesting thing. So one other way in which I could maybe want to browse my tweets is I just want to look at the pictures, and if I see a picture that I like, and I want to see, when did I do that? And I can click on it, and then I can see where it came from. But it's a simple thing. It's a completely different way of browsing the same piece of data, but it's completely under my control, and I choose how I want to look at it. So that's kind of interesting. But there's another interesting thing is that every time you use these services, when you're on Twitter, you think like Twitter wants you to think, and then when you're on Facebook, you behave like you behave on Facebook, and then you're on LinkedIn, and it's completely different. But we call this, that means you leave traces on all of these places, and they're about you. And GDPR says that you own them. But those are like pieces of a puzzle, right? And we call this whole thing a digital shadow, the idea of, that the shadow is the thing that goes with you everywhere you are. But in this case, it's a it's a digital shadow made out of a puzzle. And what's nice about it is that, or what's interesting about it is that if you use it, if you split your usage and your creation of this data driven by the tool that you use, you never get a picture of your overall shadow. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a quick look here. So I have here my pod, and if I now zoom into that pod, I can, for example, take a look at all my posts. Now here I have a post from Twitter, and then another one from Twitter, so from Girba, and then another one from Twitter, but from a different account. Again, it's a simple thing, but just this idea that I can aggregate multiple perspectives into one, and I am at the center, not the tool, is a fundamental change. So, and the similar things could be, could happen with pictures. So these are all the pictures that I'm using, and maybe I want to find out in which context I was when I was when I looked at it, or when I created a picture like that, let's say. And so if I click on that, I can go and say, okay, this is a tweet from feenk on a certain date, right? So these kind of things that we can interestingly do. But then there are other things. So this is something that is, let's say, it takes attention. When we talk about Facebook or Twitter or big players like that, they take attention. But there are other things that are also equally interesting and equally important, and we don't really pay attention to those, such as your browser. Your browser is this little thing that sits on your machine, and you allow it to do all sorts of things on your behalf, such as cookies. And cookies, I don't know, how many of you know what a cookie is? I mean, not the one you eat. Excellent. So, so everybody here knows. Interestingly enough, if you ask a non-technical person, they will just tell you what brand is, because nobody pays attention to those. They are stealth, and they're right there. And I just, once I was working with this, and I said, okay, I just want to really know how do my cookies look like, right? And I looked at them like this. Now, so I have here 10,000 cookies in my browser. And what worries me is this, right? Now, here's the thing. Do you notice a feeling somewhere here? Seriously, do you notice that feeling? Right? Keep a hold of it, because that's an important thing. This thing should scare you. Not scare you in order to, ooh, I don't know what else to do, but, get you pumped enough to do something about it, right? And it turns out it's actually not that difficult. And the very first thing you need to do is you need to start talking about it. Now, and so there are many other things like that. And I just want to tell you maybe one little story. And so these are my accounts from Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever. Those accounts that I just showed you before. And those accounts are linked with, phone numbers or emails, right? And so I just put them here, like this, because I just wanted them to, I don't necessarily think of these kinds of things. But let's see if I entangle those. So I now scrambled a little bit the emails. This is not the actual email, but I scrambled them. So if I now untangle that thing, what do I see? I start to see that, things that I otherwise think that are independent from each other, they are not. These things are much more interlinked than we have ever paid attention to. And it is time to change that thing. So who's with me? Thank you. Now here's the thing. I just told you a couple of stories, right? Now, did you notice that those stories happened in a development environment? There's a great deal of power that comes with the tools that you use every single day. And I told you that we started from this idea that everything must be transparent, because it's a must. We need to understand all the decisions at all of these levels and all the implications of what is going on with our data, including the software that shows that thing has to be transparent. This is not a tiny thing. This is a fundamental property. And you, as developers, you are in charge of that property. Whether you utilize it or not, it's completely up to you. And this is what moldable development is about. It's not a gimmick. It's not a set of features. It's a fundamentally new perspective on how we should approach programming. Because what I did, I just told you a little story. And that story can be captured in all sorts of different situations. So for example, here, this is the documentation that we have. Now, of course, we don't want to use the data that we have all the time. So instead of using private data, we have a generator of data. So this is a generator of a Twitter account, so I can actually play with this. And I can have conversations with non-technical people, so I can explain what is going on inside there, right? Or maybe I want to just take a look at what kind of entities are there in the domain model with which that we use in order to reason about these things. Especially, this is particularly important given that all these domains that we're dealing with have completely different models, right? And then they need to be pluggable, and somehow they need to collaborate with one another. So if that is not transparent, that's not good enough. All of these things, they are very important, and there is a fundamental new way to look at that problem. So just think of this. The tools you use shape the way you think. Thank you very much.